So, I hope to get to Henry IV, Part 2 today. But last time I introduced the name of Plato uh, and showed how, in understanding Henry IV, Part 1, it's a good idea to keep in mind the model of the three-part model of the soul that Plato uses in the Republic, and in particular this spirited or angry or indignant part of the soul, Plato calls thumos, is very good for understanding political types like Hotspur. And I tried to show how Hotspur has almost all the aspects of thumos as Plato understands it. And in general, we're going to be using Plato a lot in this course. If we had more time, I'd have you read Plato's Republic as well as Machiavelli's The Prince, but I do want to show there's a strong Platonic element, particularly with regard to the issue of the philosopher king, which we'll be looking at starting today and all the way up through the Tempest. But I bring up Plato because it's important to understand that Shakespeare was very interested in the Greeks and especially in the Romans, the ancient world in general, and it's very much a part of understanding Shakespeare to see that aspect of his thinking. It is what makes Shakespeare a figure of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, the great revival of classical antiquity that took place beginning in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, coming to England in the 16th century. I want to say a few things about the Renaissance to help you understand Shakespeare. For one thing, I do insist on using the word Renaissance. That makes me old-fashioned. It's now fashionable to speak of the early modern period instead of the Renaissance. This, I believe, is a public relations disaster for the field of literature and the humanities in general. You got a really cool name like the Renaissance. Why dispense with it? Be like the Hawaiian Islands renaming themselves the Central Pacific Islands because it was more indicative of their location, but would sacrifice some of the attractiveness of a name around which a great deal of glamour has accumulated, as is true of the term Renaissance. I think, it's fine to call this the early modern period. We're looking at ways in which Shakespeare begins modernity in these plays. We've been talking about the movement from medieval to modern kingship in the plays, and in general, I'm going to be trying to show you ways in which Shakespeare shows the new wave of modernity developing in politics. My problem with the term early modern is that it makes this period sound like baby steps to the full modernity we live in today. So that, for example, in art, we would say that Leonardo and Raphael and Michelangelo, those were the early stages in painting that eventually led to Andy Warhol, David Hockney, and Jeff Koons. I think that's a mistaken perspective on this material. When we call this the early modern period, it's really presumptuous on our part, as if we occupy higher ground, and this period is just starting on the way to where we've got to now. I think that misassesses the achievement of the Renaissance. One reason I like the term is that it does have a great deal of glamour around it and reminds us that this period is one of the greatest intellectual and cultural periods in human history. And on the basis of Shakespeare alone, one could argue that the Renaissance stands at the peak of human artistic achievement. But if you throw in painters like Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo, look at the music at the time, look at the architecture. This is a peak. It's not a foothill that leads up to the mountains of contemporary modernity. Moreover, I like the term Renaissance precisely because it is backward-looking. Early modern is a forward-looking term, as if, again, everything leads up to us, who are the peak of humanity. Renaissance means rebirth, and in this case, it means the rebirth of classical antiquity. and that means that this period was looking backward, but found that backward looking a great liberation. The representative moment of the Renaissance was the digging up of nude statues that started taking place in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries. There were no nude statues during the European Middle Ages, and suddenly people were rediscovering things like the famous Barberini faun that's now in Munich, in the Glyptotek Museum, a statue which Michelangelo actually helped to restore, and it's just breathtaking in its representation of the male form. This was a liberating experience. It culminates in Michelangelo's David. If you want to understand the difference between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, just picture a medieval representation of Christ on the cross, a tortured body, a twisted and contorted body, a suggestion of all the painfulness and limitations of the human body, and then set that next to Michelangelo's David, a great representation of human potential and a kind of divinization of the human body. That's what I mean when I say suddenly a Europe which had spent hundreds of years in what we call the Middle Ages, totally dominated by a Christian culture, rediscovered classical antiquity and a whole nother perspective on the world, a world centered on this life and the glory of human life as opposed to divine. And this was reflected not just culturally but politically. One aspect of the Renaissance was a revival of classical politics, and specifically of Republican politics. It's no accident that what we call the Renaissance began in Italy and in cities like Florence and Venice, which had Republican forms of government, something which was largely unseen during the Middle Ages. Republican forms of government, which, as Machiavelli argues, encouraged the pursuit of glory and a restoration of ancient grandeur. It's no accident that next to The Prince, Machiavelli's other great work is his Discourses on the First 10 Books of Livy, a commentary on Roman politics and specifically on Republican politics, which has been very influential in the development of modern politics and political theory. And Shakespeare had a peculiar interest in republics. He set two plays, Merchant of Venice and Othello, in the Venetian Republic. He wrote a series of plays about the Roman Republic, especially Coriolanus and Julius Caesar, which deal with the difference between republican forms and monarchical forms of government. And we will see, especially when we get to Henry V, the ways in which I believe that Shakespeare hoped to remodel the British monarchy on the model of the Roman Republic. We've been seeing already the degree to which Shakespeare emphasizes the role of the people in the British monarchy, that the monarch must learn, like Hal, to ally himself with the people. That Shakespeare was not calling for the British monarchy to convert to a republic. That happened about 40 years after his death. But still, you can see ways in which he is trying to draw upon Republican forms, and that's the really concrete political meaning of Renaissance. The revival in a world of Christian monarchies, the revival of interest in the classical republic. And you see this in all aspects of the culture at the time. I mentioned George Chapman's translation of Homer's Iliad. Part of this revival of the ancient world of classical antiquity was a return to the epic as a form. And you get, starting in the 1580s, and especially in the 1590s in England, you get a great deal of interest in Homer. Again, Chapman first translates Homer into English, at least successfully, in the 1590s. Edmund Spenser had written a very large epic romantic poem called The Faerie Queen. Your signet editions in both Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2 have excerpts from a long epic poem by Samuel Daniel called The Civil Wars. This epic was a kind of source for Shakespeare, and he got some of his ideas from it. There were a number of Shakespeare's contemporaries who were trying to revive the epic, and specifically the Homeric epics that celebrated warfare. I would not be surprised if at some point in the 1590s Shakespeare got the idea that maybe he should write an epic. Fortunately, he didn't, and found ways to write epic drama. We'll talk about that again when we get to Henry V. But this turn to the epic among Shakespeare's contemporaries and his interest in epic elements and drama, you'll see this when you get to Henry V. It begins with an invocation to the muse, which is a typical Homeric or epic gesture. This interest is part of this desire to revive an ancient sense of glory. And I quoted you some passages from Machiavelli's Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 2 last time, to show that this was very much an opposition in Machiavelli's mind, the opposition between the classical notion of glory and the Christian notion of humility and the rejection of ancient glory as a form of pride. That's what's generating these double moralities I've been pointing you to. And it's very basic to Shakespeare's sense of the political world and of tragedy. It's all too easy to say the Renaissance was a revival of classical antiquity, but it was a revival within a still largely Christian culture. And that created a great number of tensions and oppositions, because these two traditions, although they harmonize at many points, and people have tried to make them compatible, there is a very basic tension that I expressed in the contrast of the terms, the meek shall inherit the earth and the Greek shall inherit the earth. That is, Christianity frowns upon what's celebrated in the classical world, and the classical world frowns upon what's celebrated in the Christian world. I keep coming back to this passage in Richard II, but it does crystallize this point so well. That which in mean men we entitle patience is pale, cold cowardice in noble breasts. That's exactly what Machiavelli is talking about in Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 2. That which Christianity celebrates, which is patience and humility and forbearance and turning the other cheek, that's viewed as cowardice from the point of view of the classical tradition, whereas it's celebrated as patience in the Christian tradition. This is at the heart of a number of Shakespeare's plays. Hamlet, I think, was the greatest example of it. I wish we had time to do Hamlet, but just very briefly, Shakespeare sets Hamlet at exactly the fault line between the classical and Christian traditions, namely on the issue of revenge. The classical ethic demands revenge. It's what the whole Iliad is about. Achilles taking vengeance for the death of his friend Patroclus. Christianity forbids vengeance and sees it as a sin. Much of Hamlet's famous dilemma and his inability to act, I believe, can be traced to the fact that he's placed right at that point where the classical and Christian traditions are so much at odds. And I bring this up because it helps us understand why Shakespeare is such a great tragedian. Again, I tend to operate with Hegel's theory of tragedy, and in Hegel's theory of tragedy, it depends on a conflict of two goods. And Hegel made the point that such conflicts tend to occur at particular historical moments. Particularly, for example, at a moment of great historical transition. And Hegel discusses this with regard to Aeschylus's Oresteia, among the oldest tragedies we have, that this play is set at another one of these fault lines, namely the movement from a family-based morality to a civic or city or political-based morality. Again, it is the issue of revenge. The whole Oresteia turns on the issue of whether the family determines who takes vengeance, or whether the city, in this case, ultimately the city of Athens, can resolve the issues. And Hegel and others have made the point that 5th century BC Athens was such a great era of tragedy precisely because as in a moment when Athens was moving from one basis of morality to another, which led to all sorts of potential conflicts between the old and the new. It is an interesting fact that a remarkable percentage of all the great tragedies written in the world either were written in the little city of Athens in the 5th century BC or were written in the somewhat bigger city of London during Shakespeare's lifetime. It's a curious fact, the tragedy is not an evenly distributed literary form over time, and it may well be that Hegel's point about these specific historical moments can help explain that fact. I'm pointing to the Renaissance as another period that helped generate tragedy because it generated these kinds of conflicts. If you're trying to revive classical antiquity and its principles within a Christian culture, you're going to have a lot of problematic situations where the classical values and the Christian values come into conflict. And I think Shakespeare sees that very basic to politics. And the issue of Christianity and politics is something we've been looking at and we'll have to continue to look at because here we see that it generates very difficult situations. Many ways, Richard II turns out to be too Christian to be a politically effective king. He has a kind of Christian martyr complex, compares himself to Christ, indulges himself in suffering, wants to present himself as suffering. That makes him usually ineffective as a king because it discourages his followers. And it really does raise the question, can someone with this kind of Christian temperament be an effective king? By the same token, we see at many points where the politically effective leaders of these places have to do very un-Christian things, like kill people and betray them. And we see a lot of this in Henry V, that really in some ways Shakespeare's great question in Henry V is, can there be a Christian king? It's part, I think, of Henry V's remarkable ability in synthesizing things, that he can bring together these elements that were disjoined in Richard II and Henry's father Bolingbroke. And one aspect of that is that we will see that Henry does bring together political effectiveness with Christianity, though maybe he has to do some very Machiavellian things to make that possible. Anyway, so I just bring up the Renaissance so you have that concept in your mind, and specifically the Renaissance as trying to combine two traditions that in some respects are compatible, but in many respects are antithetical. And again, you can see it if you look at the issue of, say, vengeance, and just ask yourself, how would Achilles and Jesus get along? And if you pose the question, what would Jesus do or what would Achilles do in a given situation, you would usually get very different answers. And Shakespeare very much shows that in these plays. Okay, to return then to Henry IV, part one, I was suggesting that we see here the education of a prince, and it comes from Hal being exposed to these two models, Hotspur and Falstaff, and they are very useful models because they are, in a way, opposites and antithetical. In particular, that in Hotspur, Henry has someone who takes politics very seriously, for whom it seems at times that politics is the only thing, so much so that he rejects his lovely wife, Kate, because he's got political matters on his mind. On the other hand, we have Falstaff, who is apolitical, even anti-political, who has contempt for politics and is concerned for honor. And I think Shakespeare sets up this sharp antithesis so that once again Prince Hal can move between these two poles and offer some kind of synthesis of them. Hal will have to learn to take politics seriously. He cannot become king unless he learns that. On the other hand, he's always going to have some kind of Falstaffian detachment from politics and see through its illusions, its lies, its falseness. That he can't become a king without taking politics seriously, but he can't become a good king without having some distance on political life and seeing its limits and not becoming completely engrossed in it. And in particular, he has to maintain some sense of role playing. Again, Hotspur gets too caught up in his role as the noble warrior, too caught up to do the sensible thing at several important political points. Hal will learn from Falstaff sufficient detachment from political life to be able to gain some perspective on it and realize, sometimes you got to control your anger, sometimes you got to do the reasonable thing, not the honorable thing, and we'll see how that works out. And this is in itself the most remarkable character of these Henry IV plays, that they simultaneously take politics seriously and open up a critical perspective on it. That's what's so unusual about them, unprecedented, and in many ways seldom equaled since. We see it in the interplay between verse and prose in the plays. I've been talking about this. This is a little too simplistic, but you can say that the scenes that take politics seriously are in verse, and the scenes that don't take politics so seriously are in prose. And it really, the alternation between serious and comic scenes in the play is represented in the alternation between verse and prose. I started talking about this last time, and let's continue with it now, because it is, I think, the most remarkable aspect of the plays. It's hard at times even to appreciate how well balanced the play is in this respect. On the one hand, there is this tendency of the juxtapositions in the play to undercut the political world. That is, we have these scenes of high politics, very serious stuff, a rebellion in the kingdom, the story we've seen again and again of these great nobles taking arms up against their king. We know the background to this. It comes up again and again in the play, that Bolingbroke has deposed Richard II. His title to the throne is therefore dubious. We learn, for example, about this character Mortimer, that Richard II had named him as his heir. It suggests Mortimer has a better title to the kingship than Henry. And we see at many points the way these barons who helped Bolingbroke gain the throne now feel that he's been ungrateful. The problem that Machiavelli talks about, these people that help you to the crown, you can never satisfy them. And we see a particular problem on page 25. This would be Act 1, Scene 3. About line 281, where Worcester is explaining, and 'tis no little reason bids us speed to save our heads by raising of a head, for bear ourselves as even as we can, the king will always think him in our debt, and think we think ourselves unsatisfied. This is a very Machiavellian world in which preemptive strikes are necessary. Notice that wonderful line, and think we think. It doesn't so much matter what the nobles think. It matters what Henry thinks they're thinking. That's the world we're in this play. That even if they're not thinking of rebellion, Henry, having been a rebel himself, will think they're thinking of rebellion. That's why politics is so complicated in the world of the play. Henry's title is weak. That's why he's thinking of a crusade. From the very beginning on the play, on page 4, this is Act 1, Scene 1, about line 19. Therefore, friends, as far as to the sepulchre of Christ, whose soldier now, under whose blessed cross we are impressed, engaged to fight, forthwith a power of English shall we levy, whose arms were molded in their mother's womb to chase these pagans in those holy fields. You see what Henry's problem is now, Henry IV. Richard had the divine kingship. He could rely on a certain divine right. Unfortunately, it turned out he also needed to rely on his own soldiers, and he wasn't so good at that. But Henry has, as we've said, desacralized the kingship. He's taken away much of the divine aura. A lot of his efforts are to resacralize the kingship. So, for example, get the people behind him in a crusade. Make the kingship seem divine again if Henry were to champion the cause of Christianity in the Holy Land. We'll see that his son, Henry V, has a much more satisfactory and practical way of resacralizing the kingship. But it is an issue here, very much in the play. So we see some very serious politics here. But in a way, the play makes fun of it. By the constant juxtapositions, particularly in Acts 2 and 3, of this underplot of Falstaff and Bardolph and Peto and Prince Hal as a truant, and we keep seeing these parallels between these two worlds. So much so that we begin to wonder, are these great politicians no more than highway robbers? We see the same kind of dissension in the two camps, the same kind of quarreling. The Falstaff party, they rob these travelers, and then the question is, how do we divide up the money? Well, that is very interestingly counterpointed with that scene we talked about last time with Glendower and Hotspur and the map, and how are we going to divide up the kingdom after we displace Henry IV. And we have to wonder, what is Shakespeare trying to say here about political life? From some perspective, these noblemen, however noble they may seem, they're no better than thieves and robbers. And there are the wonderful moments when Falstaff enunciates the principles of robbers. If you look at page 32, so this would be Act 2, Scene 2, about line 27, a plague upon it when thieves cannot be true to one another. That's, of course, the problem in the high noble plot as well. A plague upon it when thieves cannot be true one to another, a plague upon it when these nobles cannot be true one to another. Or the wonderful exchange on page 33 about, so Act 1, 2, Scene 2, about line 63, when Peto says, they're contemplating the robbery, how many be there of them? Some 8 or 10. And Falstaff says, zounds, will they not rob us? And there it is, the pure logic of the stronger. Might makes right. You want to be a thief, but what if you do? What happens if the people you're robbing outnumber you? And that's basically the same logic of this overplot with the nobles. So again, Shakespeare does something very daring in this play to give us these two views of war. On the one hand, the standard epic view that war is honorable, it's what great men do. And on the other hand, we get this strong sense in the play that it's really just a form of criminality, of disloyalty, of robbery. The other extraordinary thing in the play is that we get the enlisted man's view of war. It's so typical of epic to give us the perspective of the leaders on the war. to look at the officer's perspective. I mean, that's what the Iliad does. And epic treatments of war typically look at it from the perspective of the nobles, look at great scenes of single combat. And again, Shakespeare is very much operating within an epic tradition. This whole play builds up to the single combat between Prince Hal and Hotspur. But I'm guessing for the first time in literary history, we get a draft board scene. This is on page 89, so Act 4, Scene 2. Falstaff has been made an officer in the war, and he gets to raise troops. And so we see the battle now from the underside, not from above where it all looks so noble and Homeric and chivalric, but we now see the actual poor enlisted guys who have actually been drafted. So this is Act 4, Scene 2, about line 11. If I be not ashamed of my soldiers, I am a souse gurnet. I have misused the king's press damnably. I have got in exchange of 150 soldiers 300 odd pounds. I press me none but good householders, yeomen's sons, inquire me out, contracted bachelors, such have been asked twice on the mains, and so on. What Falstaff is doing is drafting people who don't want to be in the war and allowing them to buy themselves out. This is, corrupt on every side here. The men are too cowardly to fight, and for their country, for their king, and so they buy their way out. Falstaff makes money by doing this, and ends up with some pretty incompetent and ignoble soldiers. About page 90, about line 23 in Act 4, Scene 2. They have bought out their services, and now my whole charge consists of ancients, corporals, lieutenants, gentlemen of companies, slaves as ragged as Lazarus in the painted cloth, and so on. A mad fellow met me on the way and told me I unloaded all the gibbets and pressed the dead bodies. And no eye has seen such scarecrows. So we thought war was so noble and something that ambitious men did for glory's sake. Now we see what it's like from the point of view of the troops, and it's pretty ugly. And indeed, over on page 91, so Act 4, Scene 2, about line 66, the prince now looking over what are after all his soldiers said, I did never see such pitiful rascals. Tut, tut, good enough to toss, food for powder. They'll fill a pit as well as better. Tush man, mortal man. This is the underside of war. How it looks to the poor guys who have to fight in the trenches, we would say. And indeed, we learn on page 108 the outcome of all of this. So this is Act 5, Scene 3, about line 35. Falstaff admits towards the end of the battle, I have led my rag of muffins where they're peppered. There's not 3 of my 150 left alive, and they are for the town's end to beg during life. Only 3 of his 150 men are left alive, and they're so crippled, so maimed, they'll be beggars for the rest of their life. Now, again, this is an extraordinary achievement and ambition on Shakespeare's part. Our tendency today is to see this as an anti-war play. I think our sentiments are generally anti-war in the modern world. We've seen an awful lot of carnage and of this kind in modern war, and modern warfare being more technological is in many ways even more destructive, although, as we saw, Shakespeare hints at the new destructiveness technologically of war when he has that courtier complaint about gunpowder and the use of guns in modern war. It would be very easy, and many producers of these plays do this to emphasize the anti-war aspects of the play, and I'm not at all denying them, and in fact trying to bring them out for you here. There's an awful lot of this play that raises doubts about the claims that the great men make about the nobility of war. Nevertheless, I'm going to argue that Shakespeare gives us a dual perspective on the war. I do not believe we come away with this play with no sense of the dignity of politics and of warfare, because we can't react properly to Prince Hal if we simply reject his military triumph at the end of the play. The play, in some sense, builds up to a great chivalric moment when the two knights, Hotspur and Hal, meet on the battlefield and nobly fight to the death. And indeed, Hal claims to his father, and in a sense to us, this is what will redeem him, that he does triumph on the battlefield. I want the remarkable complexity of this play, which takes us to the heart of the remarkable complexity of Shakespeare himself, is this dual perspective on the war action, that Shakespeare lets us see it from above and from below. And although he lets the enlisted man's view undercut the officer's view, he doesn't let it undercut it completely. And I ended quickly with this point last time, that this play does not undermine the difference between a hero and a coward. We never forget that Falstaff is a coward. And that he runs from battle, and Hotspur would never do that. And Shakespeare has a great deal of admiration for Falstaff, but I think he also has a great deal of admiration for Hotspur. That's what makes him Shakespeare, and in particular gives us this dual tragic and comic perspective, which is so characteristic of Shakespeare and is so much at the heart of the genius of this play. Tragedy gives us heroes. It gives us human beings we can look up to, who do extraordinary things, heroic things, who are willing to die for their principles, whom we are to admire. Aristotle in the Poetics says that tragedy presents men better than they are, comedy presents men worse. It's a great tragedy of history that we've lost Book 2 of Aristotle's Poetics, where he discussed comedy at length. If we had that, we might understand comedy better, but I do think he sets us on the right course here, and we can see it at work in this play. Insofar as this play is tragic, it makes us take politics seriously and makes us take characters like Hotspur seriously. And Shakespeare is great at putting us into such characters, of creating verse that makes us take these characters seriously, that lets us see the world from their perspective. At the same time, he gives us Falstaff, who is deeply skeptical about heroism, because he's deeply skeptical, as we've seen, about honor. He thinks honor is a mere word. It's not worth dying for. I think here we see the two fundamental impulses of comedy and tragedy, and why Shakespeare is good at both of them. Again, tragedy makes us look up at people, and it does that by getting us to identify with them, see the world from their perspective, understand Hotspur's obsession with honor, and why it ennobles him, makes him courageous, but ultimately takes him to his death. Comedy makes us look down on people, and indeed it raises doubts about heroes. tragedy takes very much seriously the perspective, ordinary human life, where we have our heroes and we look up to our leaders and think they're great human beings and we ought to admire them. Comedy shows us that our heroes have feet of clay. It shows us that there's something stupid about our heroes. It's admirable the way they'll go off and die for something, but are they dying for nothing? Are they dying for a mere word, as Falstaff claims, with honor? This is the interplay between tragedy and comedy, and why in general most authors are either one or the other, tragedians or comedians. Shakespeare, I would say, is so philosophical that he can take both of these perspectives. And here we see, insofar as we take political life seriously and look up to the heroic type, this play is tragic. And there's a great deal of tragedy in the story of Hotspur and all these nobles who go to their death fighting for a cause in this play. But comedy makes us wonder, is it all worth it? Is there anything worth dying for? As Falstaff suggests, if honor can't set a leg, then it's meaningless to him. And so we get the interplay between the two perspectives. And again, I think what's Shakespearean about this play is that they stay in interplay. That the comic perspective, though it undercuts the tragic perspective, does not completely undermine it. And I'll talk about this when I talk about the scenes of the death of Hotspur and Falstaff. But anyway, the reason Falstaff is so important to Hal is that he gives him this skeptical perspective on political life and honor and glory and being governed by spiritedness in your life. So let me say a few more words about what Falstaff serves to accomplish in terms of Hal's education, because it's very much at the heart of the play and why people love the character of Falstaff so much, even though he does so many morally dubious things. For one thing, Falstaff contributes to this role-playing in Hal that I'm saying is so essential. Again, Hal must learn how to play a role. We've seen that in the case of Richard II, that Richard II was so adept at playing the part of a king in public. Bolingbroke couldn't summon that. He couldn't make a kingly appearance to people, and he's suffering from that here in this play. Hal's got to learn how to give that kingly appearance. On the other hand, you can get too absorbed in the role, in a way take the role too seriously. Richard II thinks that because he can play the role of a king well, he doesn't have to worry about things like armies, whether he has the military strength to back it up. Hal's going to have to take that into account as well. Anyway, his experience with Falstaff is in a way very theatrical. We know that Hal is theatrical from the beginning. He explains his truancy by its ultimate theatrical result when he'll present himself as reformed in public. And Falstaff is a wonderful theatrical character. He's great at acting a part. He's great at lying. He's a marvelous rhetorician. He can verbally wriggle out of the tightest situations. That moment when Hal confronts him that it was Hal that robbed Falstaff, and that all of Falstaff's stories about what happened are lies. That great moment when Falstaff says, "Oh, I knew it all along. I instinctively knew you were the king, and I couldn't, the prince. I couldn't touch the heir apparent." We're going to see, particularly in Henry V, how these lessons are going to serve Hal in good stead. He develops a kind of verbal facility from his encounters with Falstaff that turn out to be very essential to a monarch's role. Even more importantly, we see that Hal and Falstaff are able to act out what we would call a psychodrama in this scene in the tavern when first Falstaff plays the role of Henry IV, and Hal plays the role of Hal, and then Hal plays the role of Henry IV, and Falstaff plays the role of Hal. This is an absolutely brilliant scene. Many people have said, it's the greatest scene that Shakespeare had written in his career up to this point. Some people say it's the greatest scene he ever wrote. It's just extraordinary on the stage when you see this, the brilliance of it, that in the middle of this play, we see these characters playing the roles of other characters in the play or even of themselves. But there's a deep psychological truth to what's going on here, and it points to something that's basic to the play. Hal has real problems with his father because his father is the king. We'll see this come up in King Lear. Again, the family dynamics in the royal family are very peculiar. And it is very difficult, as we see in this play, for this man, Henry Bolingbroke, and his son Hal, ever to speak to each other simply as father and son, when in fact they're king and prince. And their political roles make it very difficult for them ever to have a straightforward conversation because they're so suspicious of each other. And in particular, we see that Henry IV is so suspicious that his son is either worthless or plotting to overthrow him. And as much as they're reconciled in this play, you will see that the issue comes up again in Henry IV, Part 2, when Henry IV thinks that Hal has stolen his crown from him. So it's very useful to Hal to have a surrogate father, we would say. And these scenes with Falstaff suggest that. And here we see the value of role playing, that Hal is able to work out problems he has with his father by this scene of first having Falstaff play his father and then having Hal playing his father himself. Indeed, you can see that the central logic of the whole scene is on page 55. So Act 2, Scene 4, about line 432, when the prince says, "Doth thou speak like a king? Do thou stand for me, and I'll play my father." And Falstaff says, "Depose me?" And that's, of course, a joke. But deposition's a very serious issue in these plays. We saw the great deposition scene in Richard II. Here we see a kind of play-acting deposition scene, and it does point to the deeper truth in the play that somehow in the royal family, the son is always going to have to depose the father. Maybe he doesn't have to kill him, but at some point he's going to replace his father. And it is the great challenge to Hal. I'll play my father. You see this very strongly at the end of Part 2, what it is for Hal to realize what it means now when he's going to have to play his father. And it turns out to be very useful that he got to stage this little scene here and indeed play it being his father. So what we see in the political scenes in the play is the way people are captive of their roles. It is very difficult to get outside your role in political life. We know this today, the way politicians have to behave at supermarket openings and state funerals and all that. They never can express their honest feelings. They're always playing a part. The camera's always on them. And Shakespeare has an awareness of that. It is, in a way, the curse of political life in these plays, that you become captive of a role, that going into politics severely limits your options. It's one reason Hal has indulged himself in this experience as a prince. It's his last time to have fun. It's his last time to play act. And one thing Shakespeare shows is the healthiness of role playing. Because when you play at a role, you're not captive of it. You can, to some extent, experience the role, but without being captured by it. This is going to be the key to Shakespeare's comedies, as we're going to see. This little scene here, in a way, reveals the logic of what we'll see in Shakespeare's comedies. And I'm trying to show you how the principles of tragedy and comedy play out brilliantly in this one play. Comedy is going to be all about role-playing. In particular, we're going to see that lovers become captive of roles. They become captive of what you might call romantic ideologies. This will be so true of Romeo and Juliet, who imagine themselves into the role of lovers, and it proves to be tragic in their case because they become captive of those roles. We will see that Shakespeare's comic lovers are those who get a chance to play at the roles and not become captive of them, and the kind of hijinks, the shenanigans, the screwball comedy in Shakespeare's comedies are all attempts to shake people out of roles that they've become captive of. And again, this is a profoundly comic moment in that we see these characters, especially Hal, who has important political obligations, getting to play at roles. And indeed, it turns out that Hal is working out his problems with Falstaff here. Not just his problems with his father, so that it turns into this defense that Falstaff gives of himself, that he's the only good companion of Hal and that he should banish everyone else. And we get that bottom of page 56, so Act 2, Scene 4, about line 473. This magnificent passage. Shakespeare was the greatest poet ever. He's also the greatest writer of prose. And you can see it in passages like this, line 475. No, my good lord, banish Peto, banish Bardolph, banish Poins, but for sweet Jack Falstaff, kind Jack Falstaff, true Jack Falstaff, valiant Jack Falstaff, and therefore more valiant being as he is, old Jack Falstaff, banish not him, thy Harry's company. Banish not him, thy Harry's company. Banish plump Jack, and banish all the world. There's very little poetry that's more beautiful than that prose there, and it has that magnificent rhythm. And the prince replies, I do, I will. And this is an electric moment on the stage. There are so many ways the actor can play it. My own temptation would be to have the prince say, I do. Banish all the world, I do, as if he was right in the role, and then have him pause and think and realize, I will. Spoiler alert, Henry will banish Falstaff at the end of part 2 when he becomes king. A lot of strange critics say, this is so sudden, it's so unprepared for. Well, here it is. Hal says it to Falstaff, I will banish you. And indeed, perhaps at this moment, perhaps for the first time, he fully realizes why we will have to do it. But this scene operates on so many different levels because it is about Hal's relationship to his father, but it's also about his relationship to his surrogate father here. And he's working through both problems here. And indeed, we will see that Hal cannot be Henry V if he's still hanging around in these taverns. Falstaff points to an important truth here. Line 480, banish all the world. And we will see that, that Henry V will give up much to become Henry V. That to become king, he has to cut himself off from some very valuable parts of life that he's experienced in the person of Falstaff. But it is Shakespeare's sense of the limits of politics that the king can't be everything. He can't experience all aspects of life precisely because he is king, and that's one of the reasons politics is tragic for Shakespeare. Now I come to a part of Falstaff's role that I get a glimpse of, but I do not fully understand, but I want to present it to you because I don't think we can fully understand this play or Shakespeare without seeing it. Go back to page 56. So Act 2, Scene 4, about line 461, where Hal, as his father, describes Falstaff as that villainous, abominable misleader of youth. And that's a very interesting phrase. Who is the most famous misleader of youth in history? Socrates, yes. One of the two charges against Socrates that Athens made when it put him to death was that he introduced new gods into the city and he corrupted the youth of the city. I want to talk now about Falstaff as Socrates without fully comprehending what I'm talking about. But there are very strong suggestions in these plays that Falstaff is a portrait of Socrates. If you go back to page 11, so this is Act 1, Scene 2. This is Act 1, Scene 2, about line 95. Thou hast done much harm upon me, Hal. God forgive thee for it. Before I knew thee, Hal, I knew nothing. That, of course, is Socrates' famous claim about his wisdom, that his wisdom was that he knew nothing, that there were all these false pretenders to wisdom in Athens, the poets, the craftsmen, and so on, who went around claiming they know something. Socrates says the Delphic oracle was right to call him the wisest man among the Greeks because he knew nothing, but he knew that he knew nothing. Here's another example. If you did bring part 2 with you, if you'll turn to page 30 of part 2, so this is in part 2, Act 2, Scene 1, about line 111. The Lord Chief Justice says, Sir John, I am well acquainted with your manner of wrenching the true cause the false way. Now this is the way Socrates is presented in Aristophanes' play The Clouds. It seems highly unlikely that Shakespeare had read Aristophanes. It was not readily available in his day, and he didn't read Greek well enough to read Aristophanes. But there's the famous argument in a scene in The Clouds between the just and the unjust speech, or the true cause and the false way. This would be to identify Falstaff as a sophist. Which is what Aristophanes does with Socrates in The Clouds. He presents him as if he were just another sophist running around Athens. The last bit of evidence, well, I should say this, so, jumping ahead to Henry V. Spoiler alert, Falstaff dies, and you will see that the description of his death is curiously like the description of Socrates' death in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. Socrates dies of poison that Athens gave him. Falstaff dies of a broken heart, but they both die from the feet up. Very strange that the description of Falstaff's death has the same element of the description of Socrates' death in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, that first feel his feet and they're cold, and then feel further up the body and it's cold. Now, here's the smoking gun. Go back to part 1, page 92. So this is Act 4, Scene 2 at the very end. Makes it about line 78. Falstaff says, well, to the latter end of a fray and the beginning of a feast fits a dull fighter and a keen guest. This is the opening of Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias. That's Gorgias, the Gorgias. If you go look that up, and it's available online, a character named Callicles begins this dialogue, the Gorgias. The wise man is late for a fray, but not for a feast. I find it particularly eerie that the words are actually echoed. Well, to the latter end of a fray and the beginning of a feast fits a dull fighter and a keen guest. It's presented as a proverb in the Plato dialogue and also here. I forget how I learned this. Somebody found it. I wouldn't have known it, but it's actually a very strange moment where Shakespeare actually quotes a Platonic dialogue in one of his plays. The only other example I know of is in Act 1, Scene 2 of Julius Caesar, where Cassius and Brutus are talking about how the eye sees not itself but by reflection, and it's a quotation from Plato's dialogue, the Alcibiades one. Now, this is very puzzling and contrary to what we think of Shakespeare. You know, Ben Jonson said of Shakespeare, he knew little Latin and less Greek. Now, Ben Jonson was one of the great classical scholars of his day, so that means he knew a little Latin and a little Greek. It seems implausible that Shakespeare was reading Shakespeare's dialogues in Greek. They were not that, texts weren't that really available, but there are 2 points in his play, there may be others that I haven't found, where he quotes Platonic dialogue. Now, the Gorgias is a dialogue about sophists, Gorgias being one of the most famous of the sophists and rhetoricians in Athens. I confess not knowing what to make of all this, but it's pretty strong stuff in the text here to suggest that Shakespeare is creating some kind of parallel between Falstaff and Socrates. By the way, the name Falstaff bears a curious resemblance to Shakespeare, as if Falstaff may be somehow connected to Shakespeare in his own mind. Falstaff, Shakespeare, which adds a whole other dimension to this. But let me make this suggestion, and it really is just a suggestion. Let me start with this, that it seems implausible to associate Socrates with Falstaff, because Falstaff is such a dubious character morally. Falstaff is a coward. Socrates was not a coward. He was a very brave soldier. In the dialogue, the Symposium, Alcibiades explains what a good fighter Socrates was, and people avoided him on the battlefield. He was such a stern soldier. In Plato and in Xenophon, Socrates is presented as a character who obeyed the laws of Athens, so much so that in Plato's dialogue, the Crito, offered a chance to skip out of jail and avoid being executed. Socrates says, no, I obey the laws of the city of Athens. Falstaff would have been out of there so fast, you couldn't believe it. So it is odd. We feel like saying Falstaff is too morally dubious a character to be associated with Socrates, but maybe this is what's going on. Again, I offer this as a tentative suggestion, that Falstaff is what the philosopher looks like to ordinary people and the ordinary political community. He looks like a criminal. He looks like a corrupter of youth. He looks like an impious figure. I mean, after all, Athens put Socrates to death, and never forget that fact. This man who seems so glorious to us was put to death by the city of Athens on charges of impiety and corrupting youth. And in that sense, this is a very accurate portrayal, not of Socrates, but of the way Socrates appeared to the ordinary community of Athens. Now, there's an interesting hint here. Plato has a dialogue called the Symposium, which builds up to a long speech by the young Athenian hero Alcibiades, where he says how strange a being Socrates is, and he describes him as a Silenus, that's S-I-L-E-N-U-S, a Silenus or a satyr. He says Socrates looks like a satyr from the outside. Satyr would be a half man, half goat. And Silenus was one of these guys that hung out with Pan and Bacchus, kind of animal creature. Silenus was famous for getting drunk, which of course Falstaff is famous for. So maybe what Shakespeare is suggesting here, peculiar thing about this relationship between Hal and Falstaff, I mentioned philosopher King. Plato in the Republic talks about how things will never work out politically until philosophers and kings learn to get into a dialogue. We'll see that when we get to King Lear. Here, maybe we're seeing Hal's education, and this play is so much about his education, is in a way a philosophical education. And it's philosophical because he encounters a philosopher type, namely Socrates, Falstaff. And indeed, a lot of the things Hal learns from Falstaff are the sort of things a political figure could learn from a Socrates, especially in this case, learning about the importance of eros, of the whole erotic component of human life, which is what the dialogue of the symposium is about. In other words, what I'm getting at, Falstaff doesn't look much like Socrates, but he looks an awful lot like what Athens thought Socrates was. A drunken bum, a worthless man who's living off the charity of friends, who piled up debts. Again, you see this all in Aristophanes' play, The Clouds. And above all, that Socrates is like a satyr or a Silenus figure. And again, corrupter of youth, impious, a criminal figure. It shows why Hal is going to have to banish Falstaff, why a king couldn't publicly hang around with a philosopher, because philosophers are disreputable types. Now, again, I offer this very tentatively, but it's the way I've been able to make sense of this otherwise very peculiar aspect of the play. Okay. Let me move on to Henry IV, Part 2 here. I promised I would, and let me at least get started on it again in my effort to get caught up in this course, and I'll leave it to you to think a little more about that Socrates thing in Falstaff. But, so Henry IV, Part 2, turn to the note on the sources, which is on pages 128 to 129. For each of these plays, well, for many of them, I'm going to say something about, the textual note. I'm going to say something about the specific text of the play. Again, an enormous amount of scholarship has gone into this, and each of these plays has its own peculiar history of the text and textual problems. It's why we're very much dependent upon editors in reading these plays. But anyway, this is page 128 in the Signet. Very interesting aspect of the history of the text of Henry IV, Part 2. This is about halfway down the page. At this point, the deputy of the Bishop of London, whose task it was to censor the play, read the manuscript and ordered the deletion of 8 short passages that might conceivably compare Elizabeth to Richard II or otherwise tend to rebellion. This is really interesting. This is our one documented history of censorship in the case of Shakespeare's texts. It does suggest they were all censored, and the form in which they've come down to us often reflects censorship. Over on page 129, about a little bit below the middle of the page, your editor is talking about the difference between the folio text and the quarto text of the play, and says the folio text supplies 8 passages, the censor removed. So by luck, we got these 8 passages back. The 8 passages are listed at the last paragraph on page 29. I'm going to look at 2 of them, and you can look up the other ones. But this is a record of Elizabethan censorship. It reminds us that the texts of the plays were censored. They were censored in performance. It suggests that Shakespeare may have had to be a very careful writer because he faced censorship. So just bear that in mind. We do not have the full details on the nature of Elizabethan censorship or what results it had, but this is one case where we know something about it. Now, I'm just going to look at 2 of these passages that were censored. One is on page 41 in part 2. It's the passage that runs, so this is Act 2, Scene 3. It runs from line 23 to line 45. This is a description of Hotspur after his death. And it's talking about how he was the model for fashion among nobles of the day. So the top of page 41, he had in Act 2, Scene 3, line 23, he had no legs that practiced not his gait. Everyone's imitating how he walked. And speaking thick, which nature made his blemish, became the accents of the valiant. For those that could speak low and tardily would turn their own perfection to abuse to seem like him. So that in speech, in gait, in diet, in affections of delight, in military rules, humors of blood, he was the mark in glass, copy in book that fashioned others. Everyone in the court imitated Hotspur. Some of you may remember a passage in Hamlet where Ophelia says the same thing of Hamlet, that he was the model of everyone at court. For the life of me, I can't understand why this passage was censored unless the Earl of Essex came up. We'll keep coming back to the Earl of Essex, especially again in Henry V. But I think this passage smacked too much of the Earl of Essex. This noble in Elizabeth's court who was admired, other courtiers copied him. Again, I can't see any other reason to censor this. Very interesting if this is echoed by the passage in Hamlet, which Shakespeare would have written not too much long after, but after Essex aborted coup, and therefore after his death. Again, I think there are signs that Hotspur is to some extent modeled on the Earl of Essex, perhaps Hamlet as well, and that this was a very sensitive issue to even raise the issue of this noble in Elizabeth's court who was so much admired but led a rebellion against her. Anyway, that's really conjectural. Pages 11 to 12, it's a little more obvious what's going on. This is Act 1, Scene 1. I'm only going to look at the one at the bottom. So the passage that was censored runs, bottom 11 to page 12, it runs from Act 1, Scene 1, line 189 to 206. And this is Morton speaking of the Archbishop of York. The gentle Archbishop of York is up with well-appointed powers. He is a man who with a double surety binds his followers. My lord, your son, that's Hotspur, had only but the corpse, but shadows and the shows of men to fight. For that same word rebellion did divide the action of their bodies from their souls, and they did fight with queasiness, constrained as men drink potions, that their weapons only seemed on our side. But for their spirits and souls, this word rebellion, it had froze them up as fisher in a pound. But now the bishop turns insurrection into religion. Supposed sincere and holy in his thoughts, he's followed both with body and with mind, and doth as large his rising with the blood of fair King Richard, scraped from Pomfret's throat, turns insurrection to religion. It's pretty obvious why this passage was political dynamite, because it does raise the issue of religion and politics, which is so basic to these history plays. We saw it in Richard II, the danger when that bishop got these co-conspirators to take a sacrament, not just not to reveal what they were talking about, but to force them to go through with the plot against Henry IV. A very dangerous concoction in these plays is the mixture of religion and politics. Now, this was very much an issue in Shakespeare's day. One thing we're seeing in these history plays is the emergence of what we call the separation of church and state. It's pretty basic to our politics. It's an accepted principle in the liberal democratic world. That principle grew out of things that were happening in Shakespeare's era, where religion was at the focus of politics, not separated from it. I'll just remind you a couple of historical facts here, that Europe was Catholic, Catholic meaning universal in Greek. Europe had a universal Christian religion in the West until the Reformation. Martin Luther, beginning in 1517. In 1535, Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church over the issue of his divorce, but also over other issues, and created the Church of England, severed the English Church from Rome, took upon himself the right to create bishops and archbishops, seized the church lands, used it to create a new nobility loyal to him. So in 1535, England became Protestant under a national church, a Church of England. 1547, after Henry's death, his son Edward VI came to the throne. He did not live long. In 1553, after Edward's death, Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, came to the throne and restored Catholicism in England. So it became Protestant in 1535, became Catholic again in 1553. Mary then died in 1558. Queen Elizabeth came to the throne and restored Protestantism in the country. So in the space of 23 years, England went from being Protestant to being Catholic to being Protestant. Then, of course, 1589, the Spanish Armada, the Spanish tried to conquer England and restore Catholicism. They failed, but throughout Elizabeth's reign, there were sort of counter-revolts of Catholicism. This is serious stuff. One day the kingdom's Catholic, the next day it's Protestant, and a lot of Catholics get executed. Then it's made Catholic again, and a lot of Protestants get executed, and so on, back and forth. This made politics extremely volatile, to say the least, and extremely violent, for just the reasons Shakespeare outlines in that speech, that people are not just fighting over political issues in the narrow sense. They're not fighting just over their bodies. They're fighting over their souls, and they become fanatical as a result. This is why the principle of separation of church was evolved. And it was during Shakespeare's lifetime, really was in the 1590s, that thinkers in France, a man named Jean Baudin, a group called the Politiques, first started brooding about the principle of separation of church and state. England continued to have religious warfare well into the 17th century. Even when it settled on being Protestant, there was a conflict between the centrist Protestants, the Anglicans, as we call them, and the radical Protestants, the Puritans, which led to a Puritan revolution in the 1640s and the execution of King Charles I in 1649, restoration of the monarchy in 1660 when the Puritan regime failed, and then in 1688, when it looked like the next king, James III, was going to be Catholic, Parliament got together and said, no, we're going to have a Protestant king. If we have to go to the Netherlands, we'll get one, William of Orange. And that pretty much settled the issue that Parliament would decide what kind of king England would have and to keep it and to decide what religion it would have to settle the dispute. So that people wouldn't go on for centuries fighting over whether the country was going to be Protestant or Catholic. That's a very brief history of the emergence of the principle of separation and of church and state in the Anglo-American world, for that matter. But in any case, what you can see here in these history plays is Shakespeare's dealing with this issue. That we see how explosive religion is as a political issue and how it generates a kind of fanaticism. So one thing we're seeing this play is this Lancaster dynasty, Henry IV and Henry V, work to secularize politics. Remember Bolingbroke back in Richard II to those traitors. I don't care what happens to your souls. I'll deal with your bodies. It's out of this problematic that solution arises, and we'll see how that plays out in Henry V. Okay, I got started on part 2, but let me pause here. Talked about a lot of weird stuff today. Any questions? I got 3 minutes left here. Any questions? Yes.
What was the reference to the Gorgias? What was the reference to that?
Where is it? It's on page 92 of Henry IV, Part 1, which makes it Act 4, Scene 2, the very last lines of Act 4, Scene 2, so it's about lines 77, 78. And in the Gorgias, it's the very opening lines of the Gorgias, spoken by Callicles. Other questions? Okay, so next time I will begin with the issue Henry IV Part 2, real sequel or knockoff. It's actually an interesting debate. If you're interested, it's discussed in your edition in a pretty good essay by Harold Jenkins called The Structural Problem. Okay, so we're almost on schedule here, and I'll keep working on speeding things up for a while.